Again, thank you all for coming to the colloquium today. Today, we are very excited to have Dr. Sebastián Valenzuela. Let me briefly introduce Dr. Valenzuela, and then as a reminder of the flow of today's colloquium. First, Dr. Valenzuela will give his presentation, followed by a Q&A. As a reminder of how the Q&A works, if you want to raise a question, you go to reactions, and then you raise your hand, just like I'm doing right now. And then I would moderate the Q&A and then call people in order. But first, let me introduce our honored speaker, Sebastián Valenzuela, who is an associate professor in the School of Communications at Pontificia, Universidad Católica de Chile. I'm sure I pronounced something wrong. Both his research and teaching concern the role of journalism and social media on public opinion and democratic citizenship. More specifically, his work delves into three major themes: uses and effects of social media on citizenship, diffusion of information, and psychological well-being. Second, the influence of the news media on public opinion formation at the cognitive and affective levels. And three, the antecedents and consequences of informal political conversations. Dr. Valenzuela is also an associate researcher of two multi-million research institutes funded by Chile's main scientific body, the Millennium Institute for Foundational Research on Data, and the National Research Center for Integrated Disaster Risk Management. There, he studies the processes of information and misinformation acquisition on social media and its effects on users' attitudes and behaviors. Relatedly, he chairs the Latin American Advisory Committee for Social Science One, which recently partnered with Facebook and the Social Science Research Council to access privacy-preserving Facebook data. Dr. Valenzuela has authored or co-authored more than 50 publications and has won awards from the International Communication Association, the World Association for Public Opinion Research, and the Association for Educators in Journalism and Mass Communication. Some of this work has also been picked up by international media, such as the Wall Street Journal, Time Magazine, the New Yorker, Huffington Post, and NPR, and discussed in more specialized publications, including Journalists Resource, The Conversation, and Fast Company. Dr. Valenzuela also serves as editor-in-chief of Cuadernos.info, a peer-reviewed journal specialized in communications in Latin America, Portugal, and Spain. He also sits on the editorial board of several scientific publications and has been actively involved in professional associations, such as ICA, WAPOR, AEJMC, and the Chilean Association of Communication Researchers. In 2018 to 19, he was the Tinker Visiting Professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's School of Journalism and Mass Communication and Latin American, Caribbean, and Iberian Studies program. Dr. Valenzuela earned his PhD from the University of Texas at Austin with a concentration on political communication and digital media. He earned his MA in journalism there, funded through a Fulbright scholarship, and his journalism degree from Pontificia, Universidad Católica de Chile. Before graduate school, he worked for several years as a journalist specialized in business news at El Mercurio newspaper in Santiago, Chile. So folks, that's all. Welcome, Dr. Valenzuela. Dr. Valenzuela, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Juan. That was a long presentation. Thank you. And thank you, Patricia, also for organizing and inviting me. It's a pleasure to virtually meet you guys. Hopefully, in the near future, we'll see in person. But for now, we're going to do with Zoom. And it's still great because I still have the chance to kind of talk about the research I've been doing lately. So I know officially I have like 40 minutes, which is a long time. So I'll try to do it a little bit shorter, I don't know, but then hopefully we'll have more time for discussions and Q&A. So I'm gonna start, I don't know if it's in presentation mode. There, right? Yeah. Okay, so when I was organizing what to present on the topic of misinformation, it turns out that unlike other research I've done before, it's like very tentative. So a lot of the things I'm going to be presenting today are like results of studies we've been conducting with colleagues here and there. But actually, I have like more questions than answers. If you were looking for answers, I think we can do that for the Q&A session. But anyway, so online misinformation, that's what the topic I've been doing some research on the past, I would say, 3 or 4 years, and particularly I first started here in Chile, and then I moved to Latin America. So that's why I'm going to focus more on the regional level, right? So first things first, I think it's always important to discuss the context of where you are conducting studies. And in this case, I think Latin America, it's not only a choice because it's convenient for me, I speak the language and I'm from the region, but also because particularly in the area of social media misinformation, I argue that it's an ideal case study, and for a number of reasons, right? So first of all, it's a region that historically has a big socioeconomic gap in the population. So inequality, which is a problem that we have, all over the world, but particularly here in Latin America, it's pretty big. And that means in this case that there are also major gaps at the cognitive and the digital skills level, which in a way opens the opportunity to make it for a more relevant context to study misinformation, because potentially, at least from the fact that there are these gaps in cognitive and digital skills, you would expect that the effects of misinformation may be larger than what you typically encounter in the US or in other developed democracies around the world. Second of all, and this is probably now kind of a constant in democracies all over, but particularly in Latin America, there's been a crisis of public institutions for the past 2 or 3 decades that has translated into a very negative perception on institutions that are regarded as evidence adjudicators, right? Meaning institutions that socially are in charge of producing what we say it's true or not, what is a fact or what is not. So not only the news media, but the judiciary, state agencies all over. So in many countries, the trust in these institutions that traditionally are the ones that are producing the evidence that we use to say, okay, this is a fact or this is not a fact, are in many countries in the single digits, right? Coupled with that, it's a problem of social trust that we have. So Latin America, it's kind of on its own league, along with Africa, in terms of very extremely low levels of generalized trust, what we usually study as social trust. But it's interesting because it's the generalized trust that is very low, coupled with a very high level of bonding trust. So people in Latin America tend to have above average levels of trust in their families and in their very close contacts, coupled with very low trust on about everyone who's outside that sphere of close context. And in our way, in a way, that's very convenient if you're trying to spread misinformation. So, for example, say you are a political party that is trying to do a campaign where you're trying to misinform. That actually means that misinformation is able to creep in through personalized networks, such as when you're using text messaging and so forth. Because in Latin America, text messaging is huge and people trust a lot of what they receive through text messaging compared to other sources of information. And then another factor that it's kind of more permanent, but in the past decade, I would say has deepened, is the fact that at the elite level, political elites, there's been an increasing level of political polarization, probably less marked than the one that you have been experiencing in the US, but still, and also a lot of populist communication. Actually, populism is kind of one of the concepts that Latin America has produced in terms of, conceptually at least, for political science, is like Latin American populism, but now has transformed. So anyway, populism and polarization open up the opportunities to produce misinformation or disinformation campaigns, and on the other hand, opens up the possibility of that type of content having an effect on people, right? And then on top of all these contextual factors, then you have two particularities that make it for a very interesting case to study, which is the fact that in Latin America, and compared to other regions of the world, the people's reliance on social media or on social platforms as a source of news is pretty high. So I'm showing there the figures from the latest digital news report that's collected by the Reuters Institute. And what you see there is that almost 70% of population in Peru, or almost 2/3 in Brazil or in Chile and in Argentina, the same figure in Mexico. It's like the main source of news for people is social media. Compare that to 40 something in the United States or 50 something in Canada. And then on the right hand side of the map, from the same source, I'm showing the figures of the level of trust. So people who declare that the information they get from social media is trustworthy. And what you can see there is that, again, the numbers are, relatively speaking, pretty high for Latin American countries compared to other areas, such as North America. So what it means here is that on top of the other factors that I mentioned before, in terms of social media, people in Latin America use social media a lot for information, and they trust more that compared to traditional media and other sources. So again, that's another opportunity for misinformation playing a larger role in social media compared to other regions. So if you put all this together in the mix, what I argue is that, in a way, the context of studying misinformation and social media in America, it's kind of a perfect, it's like a perfect storm situation where you have all these different elements out there that would lead you to expect, and that's kind of the research I've been trying to, because in the end it's kind of an empirical question, but it's all these elements out there that would lead you to think that the relationship between using social media, being exposed to misinformation, and that having an effect on people's behaviors, attitudes, and so forth, you would expect that they would be pretty significant. And that's what I say, it's kind of the empirical question, and a question that I, with my colleagues, have been trying to, examine over the past few years. And I don't know, we'll see what if you buy the results we've been getting. So one of the things I promised in the talk was to talk about first kind of what's the prevalence of the problem. So just trying to see the magnitude of how much people are exposed to misinformation and how much people believe in misinformation, right? So one of the things that that everyone says is that in general in Latin America, people's concern, so public opinion, the concern on so-called fake news and misinformation in general, it's pretty high. It's pretty high everywhere, but particularly in these countries. And I think that kind of, it's consistent with what I was showing earlier, right? The idea that a lot of people are really concerned about the problem. Now, you might be concerned, that doesn't mean that you are not a victim of the problem, right? So here I'm showing, again, from the Reuters Institute, kind of the average proportion of people who express a concern about what is real and what is fake on the internet, and Argentina, Brazil, and Chile, and Mexico, which are the countries that the Reuters Institute has data on, basically 70%, right, of users are concerned about that, compared to a world average of 52, which is still pretty high, but it's just that it's higher right down here, right? So one of the things we've been doing with in the past few years is to run a series of longitudinal surveys. So basically 2 or 3 wave panel data, collecting data in Chile with colleagues to try to measure not only the prevalence, in a particular time period, but trying to see how it goes, over time. And one of the things we found was that in terms of the volume of exposure to false information, rumors, and conspiracies, and putting all together in the label of misinformation, one of the things we find is that it's the volume, it's way larger than in other areas. So here, for example, I'm comparing one of the most cited studies conducted in the US on the prevalence of political misinformation during the 2016 elections, the study by Alcott and Gensko. And what they use is kind of a methodology that we replicated here, which is when you're doing surveys, one of the problems is that you cannot really ask people like how much, how exposed you are to fake news, because that means that people can give you an accurate response. And that's not really true, because if they are misinformed, they don't know they are misinformed. So if you don't know you're misinformed, you're not aware that you are part of the problem. So here what we use is like you show a number of headlines to survey respondents, right? And some of these headlines are verified news. Some of these headlines are, false news. And some of these headlines, because you're using a survey, are what we call placebo headlines. So it's like fabricated headlines included in the battery in the survey, so that you are in a way controlling for the fact that people will say, yeah, I've seen something, and it's not like possibly to say that you have seen something because you are making that up for the survey. So you're trying to adjust for people's proclivity to say, I remember whatever you are showing. So that's the placebo corrected, figures. And here what you see is that placebo corrected or not corrected, all the bars on the right, which is, the prevalence of how much you are exposed to misinformation, or how much you believe, in that these claims that we were presenting them are credible, way higher than the US, right? So that's kind of a cause of concern. And then if you compare that data, for example, to other countries such as Mexico, for example, this is a study that we didn't conduct. This is a study conducted by European researchers on a number of countries, but they included Mexico. And one of the things that strikes me is that they were measuring misinformation, belief in misinformation around COVID-19 in Mexico compared to Spain, United Kingdom, the US. And again, it's the same result. So, misinformation is prevalent in all over the world in COVID-19, but particularly more prevalent in some countries such as, Latin American countries. And in a way, being exposed is not really problematic so long as you don't buy it, that that's something true. So we also, in our surveys, we try to distinguish between exposure, belief, and sharing, right? The idea that also people can spread inadvertently, these false claims. And so here's an example of the type of headlines that we were, showing in our in these surveys. And one of the things we find is that although people are very familiar with misinformation, that doesn't mean that automatically they fall for it. So people are very skeptical, and that helps them not to fall for misinformation, although they are very exposed to it. But still, there's a correlation between that minority of people who believe, that these claims are true, and the likelihood of them sharing, especially online, these claims, right? So that's kind of another problem that we identify. So on the one hand, being very exposed doesn't mean that you necessarily are a victim of, but to the degree that there's a relation between exposure, belief, and behavior, in this case, sharing, that's kind of problematic, and one of the things that we're finding with these panel studies, right? So having verified in a way that actually the prevalence of misinformation, relatively speaking to other areas, is kind of high and problematic, of course, the big question for us communication scholars is like the role played by media, right? And particularly in this case, social media. So if you buy the popular narrative that it's like all over, so here I'm using The Economist just because I like that magazine, but so the popular narrative is pretty clear, right? So misinformation is, it's problematic, and one of the big sources of misinformation is social media, so consequently social media are to be blamed, are the culprit, right? So just like in the 90s or early 2000s when I was in grad school and we were studying like the crisis of social capital, and we would read Putnam, and Putnam would say the culprit is television. So now for everyone it's like, oh, the culprit of fake news and so forth, it's in a way more or less social media, right? And here I'm pulling a quote from that basically summarizes this common narrative. Now, to me, this is kind of the a working hypothesis, you might call it, but it's kind of an empirical question, right? So we need to tease out using our methods, like what is really the relationship between using social media and falling for fake news or sharing more fake news, and that's of course a question that a lot of people in this area have been trying to respond, but not so many as in Latin America. So when you look at the mechanisms by which you would, try to connect the idea that the more you use social media, the more you rely on it and so forth for news and for everything, how is it that doing that translates into a problem with misinformation? The scholarship shows that there are a number of different mechanisms, right? So one is like, oh, misinformation is basically a byproduct of being or spending a lot of time on social media. So Social media works very different from traditional media. There's no editors. It doesn't follow any standards of content. On the other hand, misinformation basically is a problem that exists online, particularly on social platforms. It's not something that you encounter when you're walking down the street, in a way. So it's contained in this medium. Therefore, if you use this medium a lot for a number of things, you're going to be exposed to it. And the more you're exposed to it, eventually you might, fall for it and then do something about it. Other explanations, there are a ton of them. I just put here some of them, but it's like the psychological explanation, right? So information overload, people, it's very, we are bombarded with content when you're online. We cannot really, be discern which content is good or bad. And then in the end, we kind of, our limits of attention, our limits of processing in a way, do not able us to really tease out good information from bad information. And we end up, believing something that we shouldn't, or at least being skeptical of factions, right? And then the idea of socialness, which is a pretty, in line with the literature on affordances, right? The idea that social media, it's very socialness, in the end makes individuals less likely to verify content because, I received this, through my, group of friends on WhatsApp or whatever, and we kind of lower our guard, right? So all sorts of explanations, all of them basically, one way or the other, are connecting that there's a positive relationship between using social media and misinformation and the different ways of exposure, belief, and so forth. So using this as a working hypothesis, we basically have been doing studies trying to see if there's a link between these two things, right? So one of the things that we found with our panel data is that this is a very dynamic relationship. So here I'm showing the simple correlation. So it's a scatter plot with the linear fit, the red line, of what's the relationship between using social media and being exposed to misinformation, at different points in time. So this is one of the three-way panel surveys. And one of the things we found was that it depends on when are you looking at, if you're going to find a significant relationship or not. So in the first wave, yeah, you kind of see that the slope of the bottom of the top graph on the left, it's kind of positive. So the more you use social media, you might be more exposed, and it's more flat, down there, which is traditional media. But when you look at the difference, it's like not really there. But then on the second wave, you find a difference. So the more you use traditional media, no more or less exposure to misinformation, but the more you use social media, you are more exposed. So on wave 2, the economist is right. But then on wave 3, what we find is that traditional media is also a source of misinformation. So it's not only a problem of social media, maybe it's like a problem of any media, right? So all what I'm saying here is that this popular narrative, when you subject it to kind of, empirical analysis, the story is not so neat, and it's kind of complicated to really tease out, what's the story, right? So then what we started to do is to play around with, statistical wizardry, basically trying to do models where we control for, a lot of things. So you use fixed effects regressions, which basically means that each individual in our survey is his or her own control, right? And you're just trying to see over time whether there's a relationship between using, social media for something or particular platforms, as I'm shown here, and falling for being more exposed to misinformation or falling for misinformation. And we find that it's not there really. Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, we play with general uses of social media, or using social media for news, or all sorts of different ways of playing around user survey data on social media. And actually you find almost non-existent relationships. Actually, in this particular case, which is the Chilean data, using WhatsApp makes you less likely to be misinformed than using the other platforms, which is completely opposite from that popular narrative. Then we kind of repeated this analysis using Mexican data. So last year, we took advantage of a midterm election they had in Mexico, and we ran a two-way panel survey there with colleagues, with Carlos Muñoz and others, and Muñiz, and again, trying to repeat the same analysis that we have done in Chile, but putting more elements to the soup. And again, nothing there. Actually, this particular result is published in a paper that we published this year. So in the end of the presentation, I'm going to show you where you can find all these different things. But basically, nothing. So the story is like, you know, I mean, you cannot really blame social media per se, right? I mean, directly. Actually, what we found was like, you know, other elements explaining more, you know, belief in misinformation than social media per se, which for people who work in persuasion, when I show them, it's like, yeah, that's obvious. Like, we never expected. But our point is more about like trying to put these claims that everyone repeats all over, you know, to an empirical analysis, and then not finding effects doesn't mean they're not effects. Actually, I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later. But at least you try to delineate, you know, what's the nature of the problem. That's why I'm saying sometimes I have more questions than answers here, right? And when you compare these results, you know, in countries like in Chile or Mexico to, you know, similar studies conducted elsewhere, like here, Kelly Garrett did a similar study in the US, you know, in the 2012 and 2016 elections, and he found the same thing, right? Like the direct link is not there. No matter, you know, how much you torture the data, you're not going to find it. Which again, you know, this is kind of going back to Lazarsfeld in the 1940s, right? Like, that's the problem. You are putting, you know, belief, which is like the hardest thing to manipulate, and media uses an antecedent of that, and that's not going to work. Yeah, we know, but that's actually the way people talk about the problem of misinformation on social media. So regardless of, you know, the history of communication and media effects, it's like we need to keep, you know, showing this, you know, to try to convey the idea that things are much more complicated than what we really think, right? And not doing that in a way, it's problematic, because then you end up, you know, thinking about solutions to the problem of misinformation that are misguided because you are starting from the wrong diagnostic, right? So after you find this, you know, beautiful soup of non-significant findings, all once, you know, and twice and three times and so forth, you start to wonder, okay, what's going on, right? So for those of you who really don't buy surveys as a meaningful methodology, I agree. Maybe it's a problem of, you know, it's a methodological problem. It's like we are using the wrong method to study, you know, these relationships, like asking people about how often you use social media. There's a lot of measurement error there. Who knows what, you know, they're saying, you know, it's not the way to go. So, you know, you can use that as an explanation for, okay, this is not a problem of, it's not a substantive find, it's more kind of a methodological problem. But also, even if you buy survey data, I mean, the method, there are a number of different explanations that you can still, you know, come up with to try to explain what's going on. I mean, why are we not finding what we're supposed to be finding, since that everyone or a lot of people think that you should find it, right? So maybe the effects are there, but they're not amenable to being detected, not because of a problem of the method, but it's just because people's belief in, you know, how much they believe in misinformation and how much they use, both are in a way non-changing over time. So social media is a habit. So you're not seeing over time changes in people's media use, and you're not seeing changes in people's beliefs, because once you believe something, you stay believing that. So this is something that, for example, Mike Slater, you know, incorporates in his reinforcing spirals model of media effects and media uses, with the idea of equilibrium or homeostasis, right? This fancy word to just say, like, you are at a point where you are stable. So if there's a stability, no matter how much you play with panel wave data and all that, you're not going to find effects, because effects, in a way, you're going to find them when there's change. And if there's no change, there's nothing to explain, so you're doomed. But there are ways of testing these things, right? And then the third route would be that, of course, which is my more preferred course of action when you don't find direct relationships, is like Andrew Hayes says, like everything is mediated, so maybe it's indirect. So everything works indirectly. So using social media in a way connects you to something else, and that something else might eventually lead you to misperceptions or sharing misinformation and so forth. So it's indirect or conditional. So there's a third process that we are not taking into account that is basically explaining, the relationship between social media and misinformation. So in our latest iteration, with my colleagues Trevor Dill and Sangwon Lee and Daniel Halpern, we've been playing these couple of months taking advantage of having 3 waves of data with new modeling techniques that you can incorporate all these different concerns that different explanations that I was mentioned just before. So for example, this very fancy name, random intercept cross-lag panel model, basically what it does is to distinguish between within processes and between processes. It allows for testing relationships that change over time and that go both ways. So from social media to misinformation, misinformation to social media, kind of in a reinforcing spiral thing. And also takes the possibility that things don't change that much over time, but if they change a little bit, you might be able, using this technique, to recover that and produce a meaningful result out of there. And so one of the things we've been playing around is the idea that maybe we shouldn't be measuring misinformation the way we've been measuring, and a lot of people have been measuring, which is like asking for specific pieces of misinformation or headlines, but go the psychological way. So basically, everyone has a predisposition to fall for conspiracy theories and misinformation. It's just that some people, have this predisposition at a higher level, and others, have it less. And so what we really need to measure is the relationship between social media and this predisposition that might change over time, and that's why you need panel data to measure it, but not really focus on particular headlines, because if you ask for headlines, the problem then you have is that what if you're measuring the wrong headlines? I mean, we try to, when you select the headlines to ask in a survey, you're trying to ask the ones that are popular at the time, but it's always problematic. So here we play with the idea of conspiracy mentality or conspiracy thinking, which is this construct that has been proposed in media psychology, with the idea that people differ in their likelihood of believing in conspiracy theories, as an example of misinformation. And actually, when we ran this model a couple of weeks ago, we started to find this idea that there's actually a relationship there. People who use social media more from one way to another also score higher in conspiracy thinking over time. This is a model that already takes into account like the starting value of where you are. This is just taking into, showing the results of within person effects. So this is people over 3 or 4 years that we keep asking them, and we find a relationship there. But the neat thing is that there are a lot of selectivity effects too. So those who are higher in conspiracy thinking also tend to use increasingly more over time social media as a source for everything, right? For news and for entertainment and so forth. So there's like these, downward, if you might call it, spiral, where over time people are moving to the fringes, right? Most people don't, but a few of them, start going these routes. And this may be something that brings some, clarity to the earlier results. Maybe not. Maybe it complicates more stuff. But definitely lends some credence, much more nuance in my opinion, but more credence to the idea that there is a relationship between belief in misinformation and social platforms. Now, in the future, we would like to tease this more and like which platforms and, and we could discuss that a little bit more. Moving now to the last two parts of the presentation, and then we can leave time for the Q&A. We've been also studying what goes like downstream, right? So does misinformation have downstream effects? Downstream effects meaning, does it matter to be misinformed? I mean, we could go the normative way and we could say, yeah, it matters. Like democracy is built on the fact that people should be more or less informed. But we know, all of us know here, right, that that's kind of an ideal that we usually put in the introductions of our Paul Com papers, but we don't buy it. We know that, I mean, even ourselves, we are pretty ignorant about, you know, all minutia. So the idea here was to see, you know, if being misinformed matters, like matters for what, right? So what are the effects, if you could call it effects, like what does it produce? So in one paper, we try to see if there's a relationship between media trust, so how skeptical or not people are in terms of the role that the news media play, right? So do you trust the information of traditional media and so forth, and be more or less misinformed. And in this paper, what we found was actually similar to the story I was showing earlier about a reciprocity between one thing or the other. Actually, we did find an effect. So people who were more misinformed in 2017 became more skeptical of media in 2018, and those who were more skeptical of media in 2018, in turn, sorry, that's the it should be a positive this coefficient, but they become more misinformed, right? So they become more misinformed. This is kind of this, again, downward spiral. But on the other hand, if you look at the numbers, and in the paper what we argue is like, this is a very weak process. I mean, yeah, you know, statistically, you have your stars, right? So, oh yeah, it's significant, but it's not really significant. Actually, if you ask me, to be misinformed, and you know, you would expect that one of the big, you know, a victim of being misinformed is that you become more skeptical of everyone. And what we find is that, yeah, but only a little bit. And part of that is because people are already very skeptical of the news in general. So like there's little room for, but at least here with what we're saying here is that you cannot blame fake news and so forth for a crisis of, you know, people's perceptions of, you know, the news and journalism. It's like that's already lost way before being misinformed. Then moving more to political behavior variables. So in Chile, we had a huge protest movement in 2019 and 2020. Then came the pandemic, and we had a number of elections there. And here we're trying to see if there's a relationship between misinformation and protest behavior or voting intention. And you know, in most cases, we don't find an effect. Maybe there's a relationship in voting intention, but again, voting intention is not really important because people can say that they intend to vote, but the real question is like, actually, do they vote? And we don't have that data. Then we repeated the same thing with the Mexican data, and there we found, oh, okay, so here we find a relationship. So those who are more engaged politically tend to be also more misinformed. And as you can see from the size of that coefficient, it's like, oh, that's like very significant. But on the right side, we show kind of, okay, but what's really the substantive significance of that? And we find that it's, you know, decent enough. So moving from the least misinformed, so over time, being least misinformed to being more misinformed over time, increases significantly, you know, the likelihood of not being engaged to actually being more engaged. And that's something like, okay, so this is a thing. So it could go the other way around. So in another paper, we had, you know, work with the idea that people who are more engaged tend to be more spreaders of misinformation. But here what we're saying is people who are more engaged tend to be more biased in their assessments or whatnot, but basically they fall for misinformation more, particularly the misinformation that, you know, makes it their side look better and the opposition to look worse. But anyway, can go both ways around, but there's something between being more engaged and misinformation. And I think that is kind of a big thing that we should, tease out a little bit more. We also use the COVID, situation to see like policy preferences and not really there. There's like something. Anyway, so last but not least, right? So some effects, but not really. So everything had this presentation is like, yeah, there's something, but like, if you ask me, compared to the context that I, talked first, I thought we would find like huge relationships, right? Like, oh, this is a problem of studying things in the US, and it's a context, it doesn't work there. But here you're going to find this. And once again, it's like reality says it's more complicated, right? So the last thing we've been working on is moving on from effects, trying to see corrections to the problem. So even if misinformation is a big problem, a small problem, but anything, regardless of the size of the problem, here we're trying to see whether corrections, right? So debunking misinformation, how does it work in Latin America? So if you're familiar with the literature, there are like two types of corrections. So fact-checking would be the work of professional journalists and organizations that are fact-checking, news, and then you have a social correction. So when other users correct other people, regardless of if they're using fact-checking or not, and usually, those who work in this area posit that it's not one better than the other, but it's like both types of corrections are good ways of combating misinformation. And very shortly, this is experiments that we've been running with my colleague Ingrid Bachmann here in Chile. And one of the things we found was that actually fact-checking works pretty well. So the evidence elsewhere shows that fact-checking works too, but it's not like a huge effect, because there are a lot of problems with fact-checking. So people don't trust the fact-checker. So there are a lot of motivated reasoning, etc. But what we found with our experiments is that actually in Chile, fact-checking has become kind of something that people have more faith on, actually even more than the news organizations. When you ask them about, like, do you trust news? People say no, but if you ask about particular fact checkers, even if they're connected to these news organizations, people express more trust, maybe because it's a new movement or something. But regardless, when we were doing these experiments where we show claims and fact check claims, and we play with the idea of is it a fact check that is consistent with your own beliefs, or is it inconsistent? In all sorts of treatments, usually the effect was pretty large, and that's something actually good. Unfortunately, fact checking, what we found, is not going to save journalism in terms of its public image. We found no effect of fact checking beyond improving people's belief accuracy. So we asked them, like, after being exposed to fact checking, like, do they express more trust in the news? No, they still don't trust it. And then we also studied social corrections, and here we did a mixed method study. So we had our survey data, but then we did a focus groups with some of our survey respondents to try to understand this finding. Here in this particular slide, we're showing that most people don't do a thing. They basically ignore misinformation when they become aware of it. They don't want to engage. They don't want to correct other people. They don't want to refute. They don't want to unfriend. Most people prefer inaction. So yeah, when you're aware of, that something is not true, what do? Nothing. Most people don't do a thing. So we wanted to know why. So that's why we did the focus groups. And of course, a minority of people do something, right? But one of the two things that we found was that conflict avoidance, the idea that if I correct someone online, privately or not privately, but on Twitter, publicly, or on WhatsApp privately, this is, opening the door for conflict. And I don't want to have a conflict, so I don't do nothing, right? Another argument that would come up in the focus group would be the idea of it's useless. To correct someone, it's useless. It's useless because you might correct that person, but you're not going to correct the original source of that person's misinformation. So, forget about it. Those who actually did something, when we probed their, reasons for doing that, they mentioned stuff that you could label civic duty. So, I have a duty, like to do something, even if it's going to bring conflict or if it's useless. We have a duty as citizens to correct other people. And another interesting thing was that a lot of people said, I usually don't correct unless it's someone from my very close. And again, comes the idea of the close network, right? The kin in a way. So I don't correct someone on Twitter because the crazy ones, show up there, trolls and so forth. But when I receive, from my mom, from my dad, from my friends, stuff that it's not true, I'm kind of, okay, so I'm going to intervene and I'm going to do something. So people are very strategic in what they do. So this is my last slide, and it's basically a rehash of what I'm saying. So in the spirit of time, I'm just going to leave it here. Here you have all the papers where you can check more of the studies. But of course, I'm not pretending that anyone's going to write that down. So if you want to use this QR code, it should pop up, show you a link of where this presentation is there. So if you want to check out the figures and all that later. Anyway, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Valenzuela. This is awesome. Now we open up to the floor. Again, as a reminder, if you want to ask a question, I would encourage you to raise your hand like this. And since I'm raising my hand, I might just go with the first question while people are formulating things. So I'm kind of curious about I have many questions, but let me ask about the distribution question of social media. So for example, in Taiwan, a lot of the social media misinformation comes from private messaging apps, especially Line in the context of Asia, which is similar to WhatsApp in the States. And on the other hand, there's a higher probability that if people share misinformation on Facebook, then that has a higher probability of being corrected. So my first question is, what is the distribution in terms of social media use in the Latin American context? I know this probably varies by country to country, but it would be helpful if you could give an overview about what kinds of social media are most used as channels of misinformation dissemination.
Yeah, that's a good question, because I've been referencing social media and social platforms, but we know that that's kind of a construct that is not very accurate because each platform has its own affordances and users and so forth. So one of the neat things about studying misinformation in Latin America is that Instagram and Facebook, as in other countries, right, plays a major role. One of the drawbacks of studying this thing in Latin America is that WhatsApp beats all the other platforms. So in Latin America, unlike other countries, and more similar to India, for example, messaging services, and particularly WhatsApp, it's almost universal reach. So not only in our surveys, but if you look at these cross-national surveys, usually what you find is that there's like a one-on-one relationship between having a smartphone or having access to the internet and being a WhatsApp user. At least in Chile, for example, WhatsApp is the most equal of all the platforms. You try to find differences between age groups. Not really. You might find differences in the type of uses, particularly, like in terms of frequency, no difference. In terms of socioeconomic status and all these, big stratifiers of social media use, not with WhatsApp. And I say it's a drawback because how do you study WhatsApp? It's a very closed platform, and I don't think ethically we are in a position where we can do some kind of research in terms of the content that is on WhatsApp. So that makes it very complicated to study the problem, because you would really want to study more misinformation, particularly on WhatsApp. But the other platforms, I would say mostly is Facebook, but particularly Instagram and it's like the big one. Actually, Facebook use is going down in Latin America, and Instagram, it's surpassing, like here in Chile, has already surpassed daily usage. So, and the last thing I would say, in general, what you find also in Latin America, of course, each country is different, but in general, what you find is that people are very, as I said, frequent users of social media in general. Like usually Latin American countries are up there in terms of being, heavy reliance on social media for everything, right? Not just news or but again, I agree with you that that's one of the things we need to, looking forward is like work more on particular platforms and affordances, and it's not the same, but it's kind of sometimes complicated to do that with survey data, because you have a short questionnaire. Yeah.
And speaking of this kind of conditional effects on affordances, I would like to ask about another conditional effect, as you were mentioning in one of the slides. So I couldn't help but notice that partisanship was not part of your analyses in many of your studies, which is a little bit confusing to me, because in the United States, we know that there's asymmetric balance in terms of who's more prone to consume misinformation and who's more prone to share misinformation. In Taiwan, similar thing. People who are more conservative on the conservative spectrum of the political sphere are more likely to consume and share misinformation. And that ties into the fact that consumption of misinformation is highly concentrated in very few politically very interested people, especially if they're conservative. So I was wondering, why did you leave out partisanship in terms of many of your analyses? Is it equal? Or maybe it could be possible that for people on the liberal side, exposure to misinformation will actually decrease their belief, but people who are on the more conservative side, they may increase their belief, and that could kind of have suppressing effects in the regressions. Just kind of wondering your thoughts on that.
No, that's a good question, because I've gotten that question before. So it's not that we don't. Let me just show you, for example, the case of Mexico. It's not that we don't measure it or we don't consider it. So this is one of my hidden slides here. So this is the headlines that we were measuring in Mexico, and if you read them, they're all political basically, and actually some of them are favorable to the incumbent president López Obrador, and some of them are critical, right? So actually, when we designed the survey, for example, we were trying to see, this idea of ideology, or if not ideology, at least your personal views on the president, how much they color or shape, your beliefs and falling for fake news or whatnot, right? So, but see, if you look at the variables that we have, for example, in this particular analysis, we actually measured in two ways ideology, because one thing is like left-right, but the problem with the left-right scale is that in many countries, and Mexico is not different, a lot of people increasingly are saying that scale doesn't represent them, so they go for it's like a missing value. So another way of asking, something similar, but is like, how much do you approve of the incumbent, right? In this case of the current president, right? So it's your personal views, and that would be here government approval, and of course they're correlated, but they are not completely correlated. So that's why we put both of them. And what you find is like it doesn't, have any significant effect. So then in the paper, actually, there's a footnote down there, but our reviewer asked us, like, why don't you distinguish? And why don't you measure, instead of all the different headlines, like separate those who are favorable to one side and favorable to the other side, and not even then, and that's kind of, right? It's very different from what you find in other areas, like that didn't make any difference. What makes difference is, like, for example, your digital skills, or your information literacy, or how often you talk face-to-face with other people about politics, so political discussion here, plays a negative, from a democratic perspective, role. But so one of the, my only interpretation would be that unlike the countries you were mentioning, like the US or Taiwan or elsewhere, in general, part of the crisis of political institutions in Latin America, one of the symptoms of the problem is that increasingly people are not identifying ideologically, public opinions, more a kind of an elite problem. Like the mass people are kind of basically just tuning out. So it's like people who use the scale meaningfully for something, or people who are polarized politically are the minority, and that's very different from what goes on in the United States. Actually, that explains why, if you go to Google Scholar, for example, and you look for affective polarization in Latin America or in any country, Brazil, Argentina, Chile, or political polarization, you tend to find either examples from the past, so historical examples, but usually it's an elite problem. There's not, the only country that I would say it's kind of different in that term actually is Brazil. But in other countries, like polarization, if it exists, it's not the same way. It's not using political identities. It's different. It's more complicated, right? So, but again, it's kind of a post hoc explanation, but it's something that makes it, again, for a different context, and I think it's interesting. It helps us at least that, unlike what goes on with my colleagues who do this kind of research in the US, where they constantly have to argue that what they're finding or not finding, it's not something that is masking polarization, it's really out there. Here it's easier, because you know that it's not really political polarization at the mass level that is explaining these results. It's because you don't have the key element, which is feeling strongly identified with a political, sector or group. The identities here run differently, right?
Mm-hmm. Sorry, let me just follow up. I know, Patricia, you have a question, but just give me 2 minutes to ask this one. Sebastian, could you go back to that slide that you just showed with the political ideology, political left, right, and then improvement of the government? So what I saw there was that it's a fixed effects model, which implies that this is within person differences, right? So, but what I would expect is that these are between person variances. And it could be on the dimension of left-right ideology. In Taiwan, it's not left-right. It's attitudes towards China is the big divider for people in Taiwan. Yeah. But anyway, I mean, the point is, I would be interested in, it's a between-person effect, and whether that explains part of it. Yeah.
So sorry to jump in, but actually, I only showed that one, but maybe you review the paper, because in the paper, we have the other, the between, so we have the typical autoregressive panel model, where basically we're not using within variance, but between person variance. And it could take me some time to show you here, but not even there, not there. So that's kind of a that's a good possibility, what you say. Not the one we found in Mexico. That doesn't mean that we're going to find it elsewhere, but there's kind of again, one of the interesting things of doing this kind of research here, and not it's like this contextual element. Yeah. I think Patricia has her hand.
Yes. So Sebastian, first of all, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I've been a huge fan of your work, and I especially appreciate how your presentation overall touches all of the baskets. A very important topic, new context of study, application of theory, multiple methods. And I like how the narrative unfolds over a course, over a series of studies. And I wanted to, as quantitatively oriented as I am, I'm actually struck by the focus group findings. So you talked about the fact-checking and social corrections, studying those mechanisms, and it's clear that the fact-checking was based on an experiment. What was your sampling frame for the focus groups? It's easy to obviously understand and identify individuals when they do engage in social corrections, but how do you identify people who don't? And I'd be very curious about that, because there is something inherently rich about the descriptive data that you get from these qualitative studies.
Thanks, Patricia. Actually, I appreciate your comment, because we haven't been lucky in getting that mixed methods piece published. It has been rejected already in 2 journals, either because either a quantitative oriented reviewer doesn't appreciate qualitative methods, or actually the last time we got it the other way around. Someone who was qualitative basically saying, we don't care about the survey, you have to, it's more rich, and maybe that person is right. Anyway, so what, in response to your question, what we did was, so we had this 3-wave survey that we were running over 3 years, and in the last year, we asked all the respondents, we explained to them that we wanted to invite them for a follow-up, but that we would do it in focus groups, so if they were interested in participating. And of course, these were national surveys, so we only put that invitation to those who were responding from Santiago, the capital city, which tends to be the largest metropolitan area in the country. So it's like half of the sample actually are located in the region. And surprisingly, it seems that asking about stuff on social media and misinformation, people feel more inclined to participate than when you are running your typical political oriented survey, because we got like of the so we had like 490 or almost 500 respondents participated in the survivors of all the different waves. In the last wave, we had like 500 respondents, and of them, we at least like 90 or 95 of them, fill out that part of the survey, say, yeah, we're gonna follow up and everything. So then we had a graduate research assistant who was really good into qualitative research methods, because neither me or my colleague Daniel, we are more quantitative oriented, and he was working on his thesis, and he recruited. In the end, we did I remember it was 4 or 5 focus groups of 10 people each, so like around 50 people participated in the focus groups, in the different focus groups, and of course, it's a self-selected population, but still we tried to have balance. So we didn't invite all 90 of them that sign up. So we only invited have gender balance in the sample, and we want to have like age, 3 different age groups represented, and so forth. No, it's not perfect, but diverse enough. And again, I mean, it's super rich, the data. Now you wonder how much people are making up, because you have, you have pizza, and they are in a, nice university setting, talking to researchers. I don't know. I mean, I'm kind of being cynical here, but each method has shown problems, right? Surveys will have a lot of problems. With focus groups, you wonder how much people actually, say what they really mean to say. But still they give you a lot of hints. So the conflict avoidance thing, for example, one of the things we found in the focus group was that it's very gender imbalanced. We thought it was maybe kind of the typical, okay, this is like a typical Latino trait, but actually in the literature, women tend to score higher in conflict avoidance than men. We found a couple of papers in the US that were showing that. So that gave us an idea of including conflict avoidance in the fact-checking experiments, the ones that we ran right after that. And not surprisingly, conflict avoidance is a huge regulator, at least in Chile, of how likely you are to engage in a number of things. One of them is social correction. So it's a neat way of doing a survey, doing a follow-up with the focus groups, and then using the focus groups to more surveys or something else, right? So that's been, to me, kind of a new experience, and makes it fun. It's always fun to try something else.
Well, let me just say, I was not the one who reviewed your paper, so.
Good.
Pranav, go ahead.
Hi, Sebastian. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was super interesting. I was also interested in the qualitative aspect of the corrections. As someone who's done research on like misinformation on WhatsApp and interviewed people about corrections specifically, I was curious to know, I know in the survey you mentioned how you kind of measure the prevalence of misinformation by giving them all of these headlines. In the interviews, did you get a sense of how the participants themselves defined misinformation? Because one of the things that I found in my own work was kind of the scholarly definitions of misinformation, or a general expectation of misinformation just being kind of not factual information, is not shared by everyone. And like a lot of people have maybe kind of looser definitions of what misinformation means. So I was wondering if that came up in your focus groups.
Totally. No, that's a very good question. So actually, the warm-up question for the focus groups that the moderator had was like, we're interested in, misinformation and fake news and so forth. So actually, the question is like, what thoughts do you have when we talk about the word misinformation? And one of the things that I recall show up there was that the idea of bias. So yeah, I mean, some people would say, yeah, misinformation is something that is not true, or it's when people lie, kind of a very basic dichotomy like between truth and non-truth. But the idea of bias is like biased news is misinformation, but bias meaning literally news that I don't like, right? Like news that somehow I don't agree with, and that's something that of course was not the main purpose of the focus groups, and we could have probed further, but that was one of the elements there. So bias as something that generally it's not part of. I mean, it's not in all definitions of not in all scholarly definitions is the concept included. But I think it's much more common among people to think about news that I don't agree with as being, which is basically kind of borrowing from politicians, right? It's like Donald Trump effect, right? Like news I don't like. And anyway, we found that. And the other thing that caught our attention was the fact that they would define as misinformation news about soft topics. So soft news sometimes would show up as being part of the problem of misinformation, which is pretty odd. And that's something that, my skeptical side is like, oh yeah, you like to, look better when you're talking to researchers that you hate celebrities. Although I know just from looking at ratings and everything that celebrities is something that a lot of people, ourselves included, we follow. But I don't know. So I'm not going to question, people's, motivations, but I'm just saying that they would say, oh, fake news is, when they talk about like, we don't know like what's going on in celebrities' private life. Like, how do journalists know what's going on there? That's fake, and it would come up like that, which is again, interesting because it's confusing two different things that in our field, or at least that's the way I, think about it. It's like different problems. One is like the softening of news, but that doesn't mean that you're going to be misinforming. It's just that your agenda is like centered on irrelevant issues. But for people, they would, our focus group participants would be more mixed, it's a bit like fake news. Yeah. So truth, it's one dimension, but also, is it about relevant or irrelevant stuff, socially speaking? And is it about news I agree with or news that I don't like? So much more complex, I would say. Yeah.
Let me ask a question, kind of also sort of related, but not exactly related, on the part on conspiratorial thinking, which I'm like very, very interested in. So in part of the presentation, you said that we should move towards this idea of conspiratorial thinking, which I completely agree with. And this is both a comment and a question, which a lot of things that I've been observing in the United States media system is that media outlets like Fox News, they piece together a series of everything that is true in the report, but the bigger story is false, which goes to the conspiratorial side of things. I'm trying to wonder, I would like your comments about, do you think that conspiratorial thinking is part of misinformation studies? And are we focusing too much on verifiable facts as opposed to these stories? Because for a lot of people's thinking, the logic of truth is not one statement or another. Whether there are fake ballots or not, that's not the big issue. Whether there's a pizza restaurant that secretly hides child sex and stuff, that's not the point. The point is whether the big picture of a fake election is true or not. But that's very difficult to verify because it's an intention question. It's a question about whether the political system is intentionally being manipulated by people, and you cannot verify that. So I'm just wondering about your general opinion about, is the field going wrong by studying verifiable facts and not focusing what exactly people are understanding as truths, more as stories, rather than pieces and pieces of facts?
Well, that's a good question. That's a tough one too. So, I think there's a lot of, so many disciplines. One of them is communication, of course, study the problem of misinformation. And of course, that means that you're going to bring to your analysis a lot of the concepts that have been more traditionally studied in your own field. So what I'm saying here is that I'm not surprised that, for example, in communication, it's more popular to study misinformation, what's verified or not, using fact checkers, for example, sometimes as the standard, because in a way you think about it, that's very close to home for those who have a journalism background, right? It's very close to the way the news media define the problem of misinformation as one of a lack of information, a lack of journalism. But see, for example, psychologists don't have, a close relationship with the news media for that matter. And for them, particular pieces of misinformation are not really important so much as they are just manifestations of a more latent, if you want to use kind of the jargon, of a latent construct, right? Meaning conspiracy mentality. So in the end, it's just, believing that the election was stolen or not, or even if you think that, Microsoft is, putting a microchip on everyone's when you get a vaccine or something. I mean, regardless of the specific fact, for psychologists, a lot of the idea is like, these are just manifestations of this conspiracy thinking mentality. And that's what you really need to measure. So I wouldn't say that the field is wrong when they take one approach or the other, because it's just different ways in which the different disciplines, define what is the problem about. I do think, though, that the psychologists in this particular regard have it, wouldn't say easier, but I think have it, maybe easier, I would say, than us in communications, because one of the problems we have is that we measure like very discrete events, and for example, if you're doing a survey, as I said, if you get wrong that list, you're going to produce a picture of how misinformed people are or not that is very inaccurate, because the problem was that you were asking about the wrong pieces of information or the wrong pieces of misinformation. Psychologists, they say, okay, you can ask these particular things, but what really matters is like measure this trait. For us, it's a problem to measure the trait, usually because like we've been taught that traits are like these things that are stable, and we hate stability because it's not amenable to finding effects. So bottom line, it's like, there's like these differences. I think, though, that, what we need to do is kind of bridge disciplines. I don't know if that's possible, but I think that there have been some efforts. So a recent paper published, I think it was in Political Behavior, was mixing actually the idea of social media, of particularly conspiratorial beliefs, and using conspiracy mentality, the trait, the predisposition, as a moderator. And this was a work by Enders and a lot of, I don't remember the rest of the authors, and that makes a lot of sense. that to me is like the way to go. It's like we need to, you know, integrate these different strands, because that's really what we've been doing for a long time in political communication. We're well equipped to do that, but again, it's just a symptom of a new problem that we've been studying just for what, 10 years or more. I mean, I know a lot of people have been doing more research on misinformation before, but really the field took off after 2016. I mean, just look at, you know, the data. It's like everyone studies misinformation, after me included, after 2016, right? So maybe in the future we're going to find a response.
Patricia, go ahead.
Sebastian, I just wanted to say I'm so glad you mentioned Adam's work, because I was just thinking about his work on individuals having a conspiratorial mindset and how that links to political constraint and how they see democracy. And I think that's absolutely fantastic, because if misinformation is going to be eroding the bedrock of democracy and basically impacting how individuals interact with representatives, the adjudicators, as you mentioned, that would just be a fantastic way of pivoting.
Yeah, I also wanted to echo Patricia's comment, because a lot of the things we're concerned of are not individual statements, right? We're thinking about trust in the media, trust in democracy. These, to me, seem closer to like a more psychological mentality in general, than closer to, I believe, what, like, this specific thing is right, that specific thing is wrong. Yeah, just wanted to echo what Patricia said.
Thank you. Yeah, no, yeah. It's a very interesting time to study these topics, and as I said, you know, the more I studied it, the more questions I say, oh, we should do this, we should do the other, you know. It's fun. It's been a lot of fun to me. Yeah. So I'm glad it's useful for other people too. But if not, I'm fine too, because I had a lot of fun, you know, doing this kind of work.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Valenzuela, for sharing this wonderful talk and a very inspiring Q&A. Let's all give another round of applause to Dr. Valenzuela for his generous sharing. And thank you again for coming. This is a wonderful event.
No problem. Thank you, Joan, Patricia, and everyone else. Thanks for the questions. And I hope to see some of you, hopefully next week, maybe in Paris. Those of us who are lucky enough to go, and if not, somewhere else. Thank you.
Yeah.